Hi, Mark. Welcome.
Hi, Pedram. How you doing, my friend?
Thank you so much. I'm so excited to speak to you. You are officially the first person who's done an iBooking experience that I get to talk to and listen to. So I'm very excited about that with all the iBooking news coming out in the last few weeks and months. I'm very excited to hear about your experience. I also know that not only you've done iBooking, you've also done 5MEO, DMT together, which is I can't even imagine how do you do both of those at the same time. Because I had one of my own 5MEO experiences before actually I learned about MDMA therapy and psychedelics through some not really good facilitator, and it was a traumatizing experience to say the least because I did no preparation. I went into it and it just like it took me maybe a couple of years to integrate that experience. So it's ineffable. So I'm curious to see how you can talk about it. So I think we're gonna keep it more ibogaine related, but feel free to also weave into any other parts of your healing experiences. I'm all ears.
Okay, whatever you want to talk about. Yeah,
Let's
the
do it.
five in particular is a very serious
Yeah.
medicine. It is sacred. The set and setting are important. Every aspect of it's important. Yeah, not to be played with for sure.
Absolutely. So we're gonna dive into that. So could you like take us back a little bit earlier in your journey before you heard about psychedelics as any sort of mental health treatment, and what had you tried up to that point and what wasn't working for you? Yeah, just walk us through the journey before.
Yeah, okay. So to be fair, I did have some experience with psychedelics earlier in life, high school and college. Mostly LSD, some mushrooms. Not a lot. I went to some dead shows and stuff like that, but it was very recreational. My military service spanned, God, 26 years. And so, I was perfectly straight during all of that time, and got very far away from any of that. Many versions of me developed through those years. But when I got out of the military, I had a pretty good case of PTSD. When I retired from the Navy in 2012, um, outside of the structure of the military, like we see with so many people, all these veterans coming through Ambio in particular, um, the loss of that structure around me made the PTSD, it blossomed nicely, and I started having some problems. So I did seek help, and I just got poisoned with benzodiazepines. So unfortunately, you know, the prescriber is not a bad guy, but he was not properly educated. He didn't warn me about the dangers of these drugs because he didn't know. So, I was on a pretty high dose of Ativan 4 times a day for 4.5 years, and I really went downhill, which turns out is I found out in the aftermath is very predictable. That stuff's strongly contraindicated in PTSD. And I had all the problems that go along with that: depersonalization, derealization, disinhibition, anxiety, paranoia, sleep disturbances. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. And kind of predictably, some innocent self medication quickly progressed into pretty violent addiction problems. So I went really far down that road. We're not talking about benzodiazepines today, but getting out of that hole was a many years process. I had my last dose of Valium, which is what I finished my taper with about 5 years ago. Right after I completed that taper, a friend of mine, another fighter guy, flew F-14s, he flew F-18s, but a guy I knew from my professional community went through treatment down at the Mission Within. That was in early 2021. And so when he came back and told his story, a friend of mine, also in the fighter community, heard what he was saying and said, "Oh my God, Slider needs this." And so he called me up. I got a very brief version of the story, and I will tell you that, um, you know, if it wasn't someone from my community telling me how legitimate it was, I wouldn't have been open to it. I mean, as a senior naval officer, my corners were fairly square at that point. Um, but my suffering had been so profound that I was willing to try anything. So, hearing his account is what got me there. So I reached out to Veterans Exploring Treatment Solutions, VETS, a great organization, definitely doing God's work. They immediately sponsored me to go through what at the time was Nouvelle Vie neurogenesis, or I can't remember what the whole name of it was, but it's since changed to Ambio. But I was in the second group that went through there. And at the time, it was 3 guys in a group. It was Trevor Miller and Jonathan Dickinson, on site, and Jose Inzanza on site, very hands-on. The program was not super developed like it is now. But I had an incredible life-changing story, both with the Ibogaine and with the 5-MeO. So I walked out of there on a new direction, most importantly with some context for what I had been through, which was really important. And, I think it's important to point out that when you're on these psych meds, you are not processing the traumas that caused you to need them in the first, or caused them to be given to you in the first place. So I got a lot of work done very, very quickly, in 5 days down in Mexico. Fast forward 6 months later, there was a documentary being shot about Ibogaine. This was early 2022. Jesse Gould and Heroic Hearts sponsored me again to go down. I was asked to be part of that. And I'll tell you, part of me felt a little guilty. Am I displacing someone who needs this more? I'd come so far in that first experience that, I had those feelings when I went down there. I got a lot more work done in that second one. And, an interesting thing with Ibogaine, it is very much a medicine that meets you where you are. It knows what you need. I was very fragile when I went in there for the first one, and I had a beautiful, gentle experience. The second time I went through the forge. It was much harder. I found God and have never looked back since that experience.
Wow, fascinating. Did you ever try like regular talk therapy through the VA or anything else? Or is it always like just pharma solutions?
I did. I had a terrible experience with the VA. It was, I characterize this, it was an 18-month maze with no cheese at the end. Just the administrivia was brutal. I was not cognitively in a place where I could really navigate that system, to include, disability claims and stuff like that. Those systems are the least accessible to the people who need them the most because it's just so complicated and confusing. But when I finally got to a practitioner with VA, and I don't mean to suggest that every practitioner at VA is incompetent, but mine was grossly incompetent. And I'll I won't elaborate on that. It was really disappointing. And I kind of gave up on all that for a while. I went to a private practitioner, and that's who prescribed me the Ativan, but there was no psychotherapy around that or anything.
Okay, wow. So now that Ibogan experience, and you could speak of both experiences, what do you think was the most, yeah, what was the most impactful part, and what do you think it gave you that you hadn't been receiving before any sort of like a standard of care? What made it so special?
Yeah, that's a good question. So let me preface this with, I've led a couple hundred people through the program at Ambio now. People love to give trip reports and talk about all the cool stuff that they saw. It's very interesting. I love that stuff too. having a profound mystical experience is not necessary for you derive benefit from an ibogaine treatment. So I just want to put that up front. I was very lucky because my first experience in particular was an IMAX tour of the universe, and it was one of the like funnest things I've ever done. I say that it was fun, but ibogaine's hard, so that goes along with it. But my mind was free, and I got to do a lot of exploring. But the most therapeutic part of that really happened probably in the first hour of the experience. Um, it unzipped me. It spilled my guts out in front of me. All the stuff I was carrying around. I like to talk about elephants. The elephants, the elephant I was riding on, the warehouse full of elephants in my backpack. There were elephants everywhere, but they all came out, and the ibogaine shined bright white light on it. I could see clearly all the components of the stuff was struggling with. And it was the truth. It was so obviously true that none of it was painful. When the truth is so clear, it's just a tremendous relief. And that was a great gift. And, if you had asked me a long time ago about my story, I would have said in 2005, I killed a dozen innocent people and blah, blah, blah. No, it goes all the way back to childhood. There are plenty of guys, military guys, who go through difficult combat experiences and do okay after some time. Some of us build an elephant in our childhood that leaves us without the tools to process traumas or deal with them in a healthy way. And when they build up to some point, the dam breaks, and a lot of unhealthy stuff happens, which is certainly the case with me. But that revelation, just that seeing myself clearly, understanding the mechanisms in my subconscious, was really, really important for me. And then, it was 14 hours of, deep in it. And I got all that up front. And then it was just a tour of the universe. I met my ancestors. I traveled. It was an IMAX thrill ride. And I just absolutely loved it. That is an unusual ibogaine story, but my nervous system was just absolutely destroyed by the ad, and I had a cold turkey cessation. There was just a lot of neurological damage. I was so fragile. This is why we say ibogaine seems to have some intelligence. It knows what you need. It knows what you can handle. It is stern but benevolent.
Wow. It's interesting you use the term elephant because actually I remember early in my PTSD journey, I learned that elephants are some of the only animals that actually experience PTSD because of their memory. They have
Mm.
such a good memory that they can remember trauma. So they actually experience PTSD on an animal level.
Yeah, correct. That's interesting. I hadn't actually put that together. The elephant analogy came to me on my gray day after the ibogaine treatment. There's a story I've told a few times in other places, but I was having a difficult relationship with my younger son. Um, and you're still very much in it the day after the ibogaine. It's a good 24, 36 hours before you're substantially back to normal. So I was still very much in a flow state, and lots of insights continued to come. But the next day, sitting around with the guys in my group, I kind of had a revelation, which was I had been a northbound ant on the back of a southbound elephant. And that elephant was my subconscious and some incorrect beliefs about myself that came from misunderstandings in my childhood, messages that I received other than in the way they were intended. And so, your subconscious is subconscious, but it's much more vast than your conscious mind. It's much more responsible for your behavior, the way you experience your life, and all that stuff. And once I saw that elephant, which was some traumas from my childhood, I realized that I was passing those same traumas on to my son. That was the moment where I went, oh, this is what they mean about generational trauma. And, you know, by reaching that understanding, I was able to go home and immediately reconcile with my son. It took about 6 months of focused fathering to really solve all that. But he understood, and we have a great relationship now. So, I ate some tree bark at 54 years old, broke a chain of generational trauma. I may have just improved the lives of millions of people who might be my descendants. What a gift.
Yeah, thanks for your courage, first of all, and openness, sharing that. And as a father myself, I mean, my toddler daughter back then was like almost became a reason why I wanted to do this work, because I was like, I don't want to pass this on. Like, I want to do this work now while she's still young. So totally resonate with the story. Now, as a PTSD patient or anyone struggling with PTSD, like letting go is hard, right? We want to control everything, right? Like, and so how was that experience of like letting go to this experience? Does the ibogaine just sort of like with 5-MeO DMT, at least in my experience, was I didn't have a chance to say whether or not I want to let go. Like this rocket ship just took off without my consent. But so I'm sure you experienced. Well, how was that in terms of your ibogaine experience? Was it really like that? And if you could share moments where you felt deeply empowered and supported, or what else do you think helped with your own healing process during that sort of takeoff?
Mm. Okay, there's a lot of stuff there. We could talk about that for about 3 hours. The ibogaine is a very inward experience. There's no ego dissolution, there's no ego death, which is the scary part with 5-MeO DMT, of course, or any kind of DMT, really. Ibogaine's not like that. You know where you are, you know who you are. It's a dualistic experience. You're separate from your surroundings. Ibogaine treatments are with an eye mask on. The ibogaine doesn't like light. Even a flicker of a candle will prevent you from having visions and all that stuff. So you can always pick your mask up. You come out of the experience, you can look around, ask to go to the bathroom. Walking is pretty difficult on ibogaine. You're very ataxic, but it's not really challenging in that way. It's challenging in that it's unfamiliar at first, and when it's coming on, and I've done 3 ibogaine treatments now. When the medicine's coming on, every time there's a moment where I go, holy crap, this is a lot. Like, what did I do to myself here? Strap in, because this isn't going to stop. I mean, there's no turning back, right? So there's a moment like that, but it's not so much letting go. It's, an Ambio does a fantastic job of coaching people, preparing them with an understanding of what they're going to experience and giving you tools to navigate it. Breath work in particular for me was very, very useful as the medicine was coming on. Once it takes over, though, I don't know. I kind of like it. There's an environment that it's like, fighter guy here. It's like being in a simulator. It kind of puts you in this environment and you can interact with it, and it's not real. It seems very real, but it's not real, and it's almost like a movie screen of sorts. So yeah, the letting go wasn't too tough. The 5-MeO was a whole other story, and I had trouble letting go with 5-MeO the first few times I did it, and that is definitely not one to fight. If you are not well prepared for that experience, I could see it go very badly. I haven't had one go badly, but I could see that. So as far as being supportive, supported, something interesting happened at Ambio. I've been in the military for a long time. I mean, there's that culture is almost completely opposite of the medicine culture, right? All that openness and sensitivity and all that. I mean, that's just not welcome on the battlefield, you know. I'm not saying people aren't sensitive, but culturally, you want to make sure the guys around you know that you're in the game and you're pulling your weight, and so there's this hesitance to be sensitive, you know. And so when I walked into Ambio, I was absolutely blown away by the vibe. Um, every single person there, the cleaning lady to, Trevor, Jose, and Jonathan, and everyone in between, they've all done their medicine work. These are people who are spiritually awake. They are very tuned in. And, for a guy who came in there with a nervous system that was just on fire, just walking in the door, the medicine started working. And it's just because of the environment they provided. I've told my story about my first 5-MeO. Trevor was holding my hand at some point. That holding a man's hand is not something I was comfortable with until that experience. And, when he did that for me, he sensed that I needed it correctly. He did it. And I just felt loved, so all that support was fantastic and made it a lot easier. I can't imagine going through experiences like that without that environment. We always talk about set and setting. The setting is just absolutely crucial. And this is one of the reasons I think Ambio has developed such a beautiful program is, they've just curated that over, a little over 3,000 people treated now. It's just been iterative, and the people around it, Brianna as well, Trevor's now fiance, they have just put so much work into every little detail. The decor, the colors, the music, the scents, the food. I mean, everything is just so finely tuned. And I think that is really what makes the experience.
Thank you for mentioning that because when usually policymakers or anyone, when they talk about it, they're just so focused on the compound, right? Like, is ibogaine is this, ibogaine is that, or I don't know, MDMA is this, MDMA. But it's really like, as you were just like, you just mentioned 10 other elements that all play their role, right? I mean, it's really like a soup, right? It's like a food, sure. There's all these multiple ingredients that is what makes the food that yeah is, right? But when we usually when the professionals talk about it, it's just so narrow and this like, oh, like ibogaine for this. But it's like it sounds like in your experience, you would agree that if you didn't have all the other elements, probably would have not been such a impactful experience if it was just the ibogaine without everything else.
100%. Yeah.
Yeah. Thanks. And then another thing I mean, in the past 5, 6 years that I've been involved in this field now, I've had the fortune of meeting a lot of veterans, and something that they've shared with me is that a lot of them come from the service, and as someone like yourself, that you think like, oh, I got PTSD from this experience, but a lot of them eventually realize through psychedelic work that trauma goes way back, like it was before they even knew what military was, like it was something in their childhood. And like, have you noticed that with other folks that you've been helping? Is there really such a pattern there that eventually they all go back to childhood stuff?
Absolutely 100% a pattern. And I'll tell you where it really became clear to me is, we do a lot of work with first responders, right? So cops, firefighters, EMTs. Um, the Casey Scuden 343 Fund is funds those guys like Vets does, another great organization. So I've been, fortunate to work with a lot of those groups. And what I find out is people who go into those fields often do so because of childhood trauma. If you're an abusive household, and the guy with the badge shows up, and there's some peace, well, that's a powerful programming there. These guys want to serve, they want to help other people, and they tend to be sensitive, believe it or not. The cops aren't all jerks. Most of them aren't. They're actually great guys. They have to play a role, but they carry this stuff with them. And just like in the military, you can't go around weeping all the time. You got to be on the job. And another thing I about first responders that may not be obvious, um, with military guys, it's easy to see. I had to kick in doors and shoot people, and people are shooting at me, bombs going off, and that's easy to understand. You don't necessarily do that every day, even on deployment. There are very intense bursts of it, but not necessarily every day. These first responders, it's every single day. I mean, if there's something bad going on, they're the one who shows up, and that's a lot. So yeah, the childhood stuff it's foundational to who you are. You're uh, as a newborn, you haven't programmed your neural network yet. And the first step is you got to figure out, oh, that's my hand and I can make it move, right? But the emotional, the psychological stuff, that is being built too, and it's, like I said, it's foundational. Yeah, so that's why I think these tools are so good. Ibogaine in particular seems to open the door between your conscious mind and your subconscious mind, and it's through the preparation, the coaching that goes in before the medicine, that you make it very clear in your conscious mind what you're trying to accomplish when you get in there. And this is my concept, but I think when you get in there, that door gets blown wide open. And because you have some anchors that you intentionally set in your conscious mind, you have the opportunity to reconcile with your subconscious. And that's where the deep healing happens.
Yeah, yeah, you speak so eloquently. Thank you. I mean, it's you're a great speaker, by the way. I watched a few of your podcasts and this public speaking you've done. I just love it. You're both clear and funny, and like it's because these are hard stuff to talk about, but somehow you found a way to, yeah, allow the audience to go through it. So yeah, you have a gift for that. Now, on the opposite side, could you share where the moments maybe you felt unsupported, disempowered? Could you share some of the challenges, maybe any difficulties? What else maybe had a negative impact on you? How did you cope with those challenges?
Yeah, there is always a lot of emphasis on integration work. The way I like to teach it is, Ibogaine will blow the doors off, but there's a long hallway you've got to walk down. 95% of it is what happens afterwards. And particularly for someone who's deeply traumatized, that you come out of that first experience going, yay, I'm healed. And, sometimes it's hard to put the attention and effort and, frankly, discipline into your integration practices. And so through that, I found that some old habits were still there, and I was still fighting my demons and all that stuff. And I was lucky; I just happened to stumble into a second treatment 6 months later, and after that one, I realized, okay, I need to be serious about my integration work. And to this day, I mean, we're almost 4.5, almost 5 years out now. I still spend a significant amount of time each morning doing self-care. Breath work, meditation, prayer, exercise. I'm fortunate enough to live across the street from the ocean. I get in the ocean every day. There's healing power there for sure. And those practices are really important. Does it affect productivity? Absolutely. But who cares? You got to take care of yourself first. I mean, this is why people end up so banged up. They don't know how important it is to take care of themselves. Even, simple thing like loving yourself. I mean, I didn't have that. I didn't even know it was a thing. That's something I learned through the 5-MeO. But yeah, so there were times when I neglected my practices. That's on me. The support was always there. Vets and 343. I mean, they do a great job of providing follow-on integration, one-on-one coaching for sure, but also, they have groups every week. They have groups for spouses as well. fantastic place. Some of the best people you ever want to meet are in those groups, and lots of meaningful friendships are formed there. But listening to other people go through their process is super helpful when new people come into those groups.
Yeah, I mean, one of the folks that I know who's obviously done a similar journey, you probably know him, not gonna mention his name as for his privacy, but he sort of mentioned that it's like when, people who in the military service, like you have this strong community when you're there, but when you come out of the service, then it's a very isolating experience. You no longer have that. And then in his experience, when he said he found other people on the healing journey, even if they were not veterans or first responders, it's sort of like that became his new community. Like, he was able to, but is that sort of another pattern that you
We
noticed?
see it all the time. So the two guys I went through with the first time, one of them I knew well, another one I'd never heard of before. We are all great friends to this day. The group I went through the second time was all aviators. So, we had a lot in common. We still, I mean, here we are 4 years later. We talk every day. These are my best friends. Anytime I'm, they're all over the country. Anytime I'm near one, we stay at each other's houses, and these are my people. And of course, through Ambio, I mean, I see these group chats. Those things stay forever. Not every group is the same, but I would say largely these people just naturally bond through this medicine experience, and they support each other instinctively. um, it's helpful to have a great five experience and understand the fundamental interconnectedness of everything, and they just feel that, and there's lots of great organic support there.
Yeah, and that goes back to this importance of lived experience, right? Like sometimes you don't even need to talk about it. Just knowing that somebody else has done 5-MeO and then you look in each other's eyes, you're like, I know. Like I remember talking about like some person said just I know. That was all I wanted to hear. Like it was like that's it because they had done it, right? It's like that shared lived experience is something it's very hard to find anywhere else. Now, now, can we talk a little bit about the preparation and integration? You did bring that up. How was that for you? Could you share a bit more about, yeah, what kind of preparation integration did you receive and how did those two ends impacted your outcome?
Yeah, so I had the best coach ever. Um, I won't say her name because I don't want to offend anybody else, but she is the best. And when people are really struggling, she's the one that I call up and send them to. She's been with vets for very long. She's not now, but she was with vets for a very long time. Um, yeah, that one-on-one was fantastic. I don't care how good a coach is, you don't connect the same way with everyone. Um, but with her, I consider her a dear personal friend, after many years of stuff. So she's been super helpful to me. But honestly, most of the work has happened with that group I went through the second time. We all have similar backgrounds. We speak the same language. We appreciate the same humor. Um, and it's a bunch of dudes who maybe outwardly look like badasses. They're sweet guys, man. Yeah, we love each other, and it's nice. Yeah, it's that community that really did it for me.
I love that, and it really echoes my own experience too. Some of these people, like from outside, like I met them, I'm like, oh, like these like big guys, big muscles, they look so scary, and then you meet them in real life, and they're like they're just some of the sweetest, softest hearted people I've met in
Oh
my
yeah,
life. It's such a humbling experience.
that's one of the fun things at Ambio. I mean, I remember one guy in particular. I won't say his name, but he was a Delta guy, Army Special Forces, built like an all-pro linebacker, tatted up. I mean, just an absolute beast. I can't imagine that guy coming through the door with a machine gun. You want to talk about some terror? Um, and he was hugging me and crying and telling me how much he loves me. I'm like, yes, yes. So I make a joke, we take stone cold killers and we turn them into hippies.
Oh, I love it. You spoke about this coach, which is interesting because a lot of times in this work, when people think about integration or any aspect of it, you think it's therapy and it's like some sort of a therapist role. But it seems like you had a coach. Could you share more on that? Like, general a little bit on the quality of the care team and the therapist or any other person involved, and how do you think that impacted your journey? Yeah, like how did you experience therapy versus coaching?
Yeah, so I had been, of course, there was a divorce in my story there. Went through many years of marriage counseling with a great counselor. She was very intuitive and she was brutally honest, and I learned a lot about myself. That unfortunately the marriage failed, but that was really, really useful. But she stayed well within the boundaries of her professional training. These integration coaches, mine actually happened to be she's got a lot of letters after her name. She had a lot of experience, and she happens to be that. But that's not what made it so special. And what I see with all these coaches, they've done their medicine work, so that the training is important. It's very important, being true to you. One example of a course that people go through, they come out of there very well trained, very competent. But the more important part is they've all done their own medicine work. And so you connect on a very human level. And, you don't necessarily have to talk about therapy stuff all the time. Sometimes it's, I'm trying to figure out what Jesus means. That's a conversation I've had. Like, I don't understand the whole thing. What's that got to do? Well, it turns out it has a lot to do with it, but you're not going to have a traditional therapist have that conversation with you, probably, right? So, you start wondering about the nature of your own consciousness, and does life persist? Does consciousness persist beyond death? What's the meaning of suffering? I mean, all these questions that come up in medicine work. That's why these integration coaches are really special people.
Fantastic. So glad that you had a good one. Now, looking back, what do you think clinicians or researchers might be overlooking when they're designing or delivering such treatments?
Um, Yeah. The people who are doing this work right now, another like Martin Polanco at the Mission Within. I mean, that's kind of where that started and all that. And these guys at Ambio and all that. I mean, these guys have been doing this for a long, long time, and they have a deep understanding of how this works. One of my worries is as this stuff gets medicalized and morphed into the existing constructs that aren't really optimized for this sort of stuff. I I hope that the spiritual component does not get lost. Ibogaine is a, like I say, it's a very intelligent medicine at a neurological level. When you start talking about cellular metabolism and all these things that it affects, yeah, that's important hard science that, we know it works. We want to understand more how it works. And that's a lot of the research. But when you go clinical, it's very important for these clinicians to understand how important the spiritual aspect is. And Brian Hubbard, becoming famous for saying things like addiction is fundamentally a malady of the soul, 100% accurate. So, I just hope that that doesn't get lost. And this may be a very high bar for a lot of traditionally trained practitioners who maybe want to transition into this. They've got to do some medicine work. I mean, you should not be providing if you don't know from having experienced it yourself. I mean, I just don't understand. You couldn't get there because it's so, and used the word ineffable earlier. That is the right word. I mean, you have to live this to really understand how to use it as a tool for healing.
100% I agree with you. That is a given, and yeah, I mean, there's more of that happening, which is wonderful to hear. But obviously, some of these professionals have a license to worry about and jobs to worry about, and at times they might not be able to even share that, that they have those experiences. But through this experience of myself doing these interviews with others, we all the pattern is that that we feel more understood. We feel we can relate to these professionals when we know they have their own lived experiences, especially with the modality that they're offering. Now, yeah, do you have anything else you want to say there on that? Or
Oh well, for regulators, I think yeah, your questions are here, but another thing for regulators is we're so wed to placebo controlled trials, which is ridiculous with a psychedelic. Did I get the ibogaine? If you got the that doesn't work. They're so wed to RCTs and all this stuff, and I get it. Safety, it's valid, but I think it's very, very important that we assign a lot of value to indigenous cultures and what's encoded in their cultural experiences is very important. Safety and efficacy, with a medicine that's been used for thousands of years in your culture, it's programmed in there. Maybe they don't understand on a molecular level, but it's in there. And I think we would do ourselves a huge favor if we assimilate that as vigorously as we can. I don't want to see 20 years of RCTs before veterans stop killing themselves. It's an emergency. And this is why we have to escape the system we have here. And, veterans, we've built our own system because the old one wasn't working, so, I hope people pay attention to that.
yeah, someone else I interviewed who had done MDMA therapy for PTSD, and he said better is good enough. Like
Mm-hmm.
we don't have to get this perfect. We can't baby proof everything, right?
Well,
Like
let's keep people alive and optimistic about what's ahead of them.
yeah.
When you lose hope, it's just very hard to stay alive. I was there. I mean, I'm glad I'm sitting here right now.
Yeah, and absolutely. And this like push against like trying to like making it perfect, like we end up losing hope, right? And that is the healing. It starts with that hope, right? I mean, it's like because then if you start reading the news, that it's all like all the terrible things happen and all the side effects and all this is like, well, then now those that are suffering, well, they just think they found some new hope, and now they might start losing that hope, right? Because they think it's not perfect to the level that our medical system wants to roll it around, right? And that's the unfortunate thing. But I'm hopeful that stories like this will help with that. Now, there's something around the PTSD diagnosis that I want to mention. Another thing that I've heard from some other veterans that is like, so I think someone even called it just like a souvenir from the service or something. Like there was like a sense of like pride around coming back from service with PTSD that they had hard time even letting go of that because they're like, well, then who am I? Like I suffered, I did all these things, and now I have this PTSD is what I remember of what my suffering is now. Like letting go of that diagnosis and like to life without PTSD wasn't serving that sort of the identity around it. Have you noticed anything on that in your own experience or people you work with?
I saw that in 12 step. It seems like some people get into that program and that's just their thing for the rest of their life. They don't seem to want to grow beyond it or not need to go to a meeting every day. Yeah, that happens. Coming out of the military is particularly difficult. I never looked at myself as a guy with a job. I'm a fighter pilot. That's who I am, but then all of a sudden you're not. One of my friends said something to me one day that really stuck. He said, you're 44 years old and all the coolest things you're ever going to do in your life are already behind you. Like, what do you do with that? And that's true for probably a lot of people in the military, especially if you do 20 years or more. Yeah, so you have to remake yourself, and if you have a fully developed case of PTSD, that's your new identity, right? And so ripping that character out and building a new one, I mean, when your head's spinning, that's very hard to do. um, and I think that's this combination of ibogaine and 5-meo. I mean, it's just they're so complementary. They're a 1-2 punch. You see what you're hanging on to that isn't serving you with the ibogaine, and then the 5-meo gives you an understanding of the fundamental nature of your being, which is pure love and consciousness. That may sound silly if you haven't done 5-MeO DMT, but just strap in and trust me on this one.
Yeah, absolutely. So what's the rationale for doing 5-MeO after ibogaine versus other way around?
Yeah. So, the ibogaine, I mean, it leaves you very open for a while. There is a glow or a pink phase, some people call it, that lasts for weeks, even months. I mean, I have a nice 2 to 3 month glow. That's, the period of enhanced neuroplasticity. But it's a heart opener. I mean, you're very raw, you're very open. The 5-MeO hits differently after the ibogaine. I've certainly experienced it plenty of times, not proximate to an ibogaine experience. Uh, it's a little different. But particularly for someone, and we have a lot of guys who come through, they, never smoked a joint, you know, everybody's an alcoholic. That's in the military culture, but these are pretty straight guys, and 5-MeO is big. Um, so I think the ibogaine kind of softens you up a little bit and makes that idea of letting go more accessible. And so you're less likely to fight. If you go into a 5-MeO experience and you fight it can be hellish. You're nodding like yeah, it can be quite hellish. So the ibogaine is just great prep for that. And I described the ibogaine as an inward experience. The 5-MeO is an outward experience. So the ibogaine is all about you, what's going on inside. The 5-MeO is all about everything. And so it really completes the picture, or fills in the Venn diagram. I think that's why they're so complementary.
Oh, that makes so much sense. Now that you put it in words like that, it makes totally sense. I can see why it comes next. Now, let's get a bit philosophical here, Mark. Who do you think you are because of these experiences? And who do you think you might have been without them? If even here, who knows?
I'd be dead. I mean, to put it bluntly, I mean, this stuff saved my life. I mean, there was so much wreckage. You know, I, the only reason I'm alive at all is because I have children. And, when it came down to it, I couldn't do that to them. My love for my children kept me alive. But, I couldn't have struggled the way I was struggling forever. I mean, I would have given up. Um, so it gave that to me. I mean, I'm a much better version of myself now. Uh, fell after doing my work for some years, and I drank a lot of ayahuasca for a couple of years following that, and just kind of digging deeper and some shadow work and all that stuff. As my nervous system settled down, as I really came to understand the purpose of suffering in this life, it was easy for me to let go of all these cultural expectations that cause you to suffer. Shame. You mentioned shame earlier. I was an IV drug addict. I mean, I was in the gutter for a while, and my arms are all scarred up from that. I wore long sleeve shirts for about 7 years, year round. I mean, I'd be out and I coached some sports and stuff, out on the turf in the middle of summer. I mean, I was dying. I didn't want anybody to see, and I came to understand that suffering is a gift, because I wouldn't have forged a relationship with our creator, or even known to look for one, without that. And that's an important aspect of my life. My prayer practice is very vigorous. I can promise you, anyone listening hasn't tried prayer. There's two keys to it. One is you have to do it all the time. And the second one is you have to really mean it. You have to humble yourself and ask for guidance. And if you do that consistently, I've found that I get it. The answers are very clear. And, if you put your ego aside and allow yourself to be guided by the hand and the voice, I call it, um, good things start happening in your life. I mean, people talk about manifesting, you know, I'm not a super woo guy, believe it or not. I'm not going to sit here and put up a vision board and want to be wealthy and all of a sudden I will be. No, it's about submitting to ask how you can humbly serve your brothers and sisters. And if you do that, I'm still in that process right now, but I'm finding that a lot of great things are coming into my life. And as a guy who solved problems with explosives professionally, I'm totally the other way now. Now I need to trust that our creator has us, uh, because it's the truth. And if you trust that and if you lean into that, you have to do your work. You're here for a reason. You have to do things. But if you do that informed by that, you are being guided. And if you're a good pupil, your life will continue to get better. It does.
Beautiful. So in this work, there's this concept of inner healer or inner healing intelligence. Have you heard of that term before? Like it's sort of like, at least in the MDMA therapy world, it's really used, and I'm sure in other treatments people. How did you experience this sort of like, I mean, you spoke about God and religion, and like, how did you experience these two like sources? Maybe on one hand, there's this intelligence inside yourself that wants to heal, but then there's also this intelligence outside of you that maybe has a purpose. Like, how did you experience these two worlds?
Yeah. So, um, my first 5-MeO story is pretty crazy. If you look, I've got a YouTube channel that's on there. There's not much content on there. I just throw things up once in a while, but I talk about that a lot. Um, to shorten it, I had this profound realization that doesn't sound so profound to me right now. It almost sounds silly, but in the moment, it was absolutely life changing, which is I'm the one who's supposed to do these things. I am the one who is supposed to allow our creator to shine through me. It's me. And when I say me, I mean it's you too. It's each of us. You have to do it. You have to seek that wisdom and that intelligence that is available to you when you surrender. And if you do, um, that light shines on everyone around you. I mean, the best thing you can do to make the world a better place is work on yourself and be the best version of yourself that you can be. Raise your vibration, and I'm an electrical engineer. I have communication systems, all that. When people talk about vibrations and frequencies, sometimes I have to cringe a little bit, but it's a little bit of a metaphor. If you're comfortable in your relationship with our creator, that just shines on everyone. And I've found that this kind of talk puts some people off, but you know what, it's brought many, many more people towards me, and it's people that they're seekers. What a beautiful community, and it's diverse in every aspect you can imagine. But when you're all seeking meaning in your life, you can look past all that other stuff very easily.
Beautiful, beautiful. So, what would you say now to someone watching this who is maybe beginning of that journey? They're about to go through something you've done. What do you wish you knew before going in?
Whew. First of all, is don't be afraid. You hear Ibogaine in particular is pretty tough on people. I promise you, you're going to be fine. Don't be afraid. It's just you in there. You know. Now I say that, but I also hear myself saying to people at Ambio, like the scariest person in the world is that guy in the mirror, right? Don't be afraid. I mean, you're God's creation. God doesn't make broken stuff. God puts a path ahead of you, and if it's difficult, it's because you can handle it. So don't be afraid of this work. The other one is take your preparation very seriously. I can't stand it when the Ibogaine ceremonies tonight, and I say, let's talk about your intentions. And, I get the saucers like, dude, like you needed to program yourself with this for weeks ahead of time. Take that seriously. Different places do it different ways, depends what program you're coming through. They may give you a workbook. If you're angry at the world, suffering through PTSD, you may do a stupid workbook. Trust me, bro, do the workbook. Find some quiet time. You can say, I hate this shit, but I'm going to do it anyway. But when you get in there, do it, and you got to write things down. Don't read the question and go, okay, I got that. No, write it down. There are neurological reasons why writing these things down strengthens those pathways. And you need those when you get into your medicine experience, like I talked about earlier. That's really important. The other one is, if you are not committed to becoming a substantially different version of yourself, there's a good chance you'll fail. We do see people who come back 6-12 months later and they go, I didn't get it the first time. Now I know what you meant. So, plan to make space for integration when you get home. And, for me, it was half the day, every day for a long time. I'm very fortunate that I was able to keep a roof over my head and feed myself through that process. But to the extent that the demands of this earthly life require, outside of that, make your integration work your purpose. You have to do that. I mean, 6 months, a year, minimum. Just go, I am going to reprogram my default mode network in a way that is healthy for me and enables me to withstand the noise and the pressures of, this concrete world, because, it's always going to push you to worse. You have to, learn to separate yourself from that stuff. These roles, these demands, these things you have to do to protect your ego. Forget that crap, man. Separate yourself from it. Be the observer. When life hands you a shit sandwich, go, oh, look, a shit sandwich. Why do I have a shit sandwich in front of me? What can I learn from this? How can I be different so I get fewer shit sandwiches? That's a part of being a good pupil. So you've really got to dedicate yourself to that path, and you've got to be willing to shed those old skins and get to know that golden core of, what you really are, because we're all that. I'm a little kid. I'm my parents' baby. we just delude ourselves with all this ego stuff. You're just a kid. You should be walking around with wonder, because this world is a wonderful place if you choose to notice. I think that's another thing the 5 does, because I remember coming out of the 5 and, I'm looking at the Pacific Ocean, and I remember thinking, my God, I never noticed how beautiful the world is. I never looked at a flower. I was an aviator. I love the air. I was a skydiver. That's always been nice. But there's nice and there's astoundingly beautiful, which once you experience that, it's something you can take with you, and an example I like to use is, I was a road rager, like most guys with PTSD are. What happens to me when some jerk cuts me off and hits his brakes now? I look at the sky and go, what a beautiful world. I wonder what's bothering that guy.
Wow.
We need more of that.
I try to put that in a clinical scale. You know what I mean? Like, these are the aspects of healing that it's so silly when we try to like fit it in this clinical trial model and these clinical scales, and it's just like, you just can't, right? Some of this stuff. But funny, actually, to keep it on theme, I know you're a pilot. It's like in another interview, this came up that I feel like this preparation integration are sort of like the airports and runway you take off from and where you land the plane, right? A lot of times people just think it's about the flying part, right? And then they get on the plane, they're like, well, shit, where do I land this plane now, right? So I feel like,
no, flying's easy. Landing is hard.
But in this work, you need to build your own airport from where you're going to take off. Make sure you have a good airport to land the plane. You can't just jump on the plane and think that this is going to work out for you, right? Like, you're going to be the pilot of that plane. whether you like it or
Correct, and
not.
that's why the integration, your integration coach will listen to you and help you understand where to build your airport and what it's supposed to look like, and all that stuff for sure.
Exactly. I love that. Okay, so if health professionals or policymakers could understand maybe one thing from your lived experience, what do you want them to hear?
Well, one, I kind of touched on the so two parts is one is the urgency of this. The 22 depends which study you look at. 44 a day. I don't know what it's somewhere in there. I certainly know way too many guys who've taken their own lives. This is a national emergency. It is a national embarrassment that our combat veterans have to seek treatment outside the country. And you at the beginning you said Texas, Arizona, Colorado, all those things just happened. That's just the beginning of the dominoes. Something that Governor Perry doesn't hasn't talked about it anywhere I've seen him in public, but I've heard him say is he's going to every state and he's telling that story. The fact that Marcus Luttrell had the courage to knock on the governor's mansion door and go, "Hey, remember that time you told me to stop by? Here I am." Right. So, Rick Perry's a guy, he was a conservative icon. He's not a guy you would think would have gone to this, but the reason he did is because Marcus lived in his house and he watched him go through his healing journey. And he recently came out and said, I'm dedicating the rest of my life to this cause. And I happen to know that some of his political advisors warned him against that. And he knew he was right, and he is. So to have a guy like him in particular, and Brian Hubbard came out of nowhere. I mean, what a personality that guy. By the way, he is everything he looks like he is. He is the sweetest guy on planet Earth. He has a heart of a bear, and his mastery of the English language is what a jewel. I mean, to
I
have that.
love the guy.
Oh, he's
I
fantastic. So, that team and the organization they've put together, and there's a lot of veterans, like me, who've spent a lot of time talking to legislators and stuff, and they facilitate a lot of that. This campaign is big. We're going to leave the federal government no choice but to deschedule this stuff. And I think DEA knows it's coming. There were some of these novel tryptamines that were up for scheduling a couple of years ago, and FDA looked at it and just went, why bother? This is coming. So, those guys are doing great work. It needs to continue. There's a lot of road ahead. Until the DOD is taking guys and on active duty and going, man, you just came out of a combat theater. I mean, here's what I'd like to see. I would love to see you're coming out of Indian country. Before you go home to your wife and kids, let's sit with some ayahuasca and work through some stuff. If you're a legislator listening to this, it saves money. You spend millions of dollars. These operators, SEALs, these high-level special ops guys, or aviators. I mean, millions of dollars are spent on training us. Marcus Capone's a great example. I think he was at 13 years medically discharged. I mean, he was at the top of his game as a tactician, but he was wrecked. There's what a waste. So if nothing else, it just makes financial sense. And then, we see these guys, at Ambio, they come in the door and they have a gallon freezer bag full of psych meds, and they've been told they're going to be on those the rest of their lives. By the way, not once has one of those guys told me that it made their lives better. It makes them worse. What's the cost of that? It's incredible. Not only the cost of the medication that they have to be on the doctor's visits, but lost productivity, the way their families are affected. I mean, it's when you go to second and third order effects, this is horrible. I know it's a long road to get the VA to endorse something like that, and I'm glad that there's some clinical trials starting. I'd like to see that move more quickly. I'd like to see more money thrown at it, but I mean, just from a fiscal standpoint, there's a powerful motive to give guys access to this. We should be shoving it at them.
No, I hear you, and I guess to some extent, maybe some of the government people were maybe scared of these being like some hippie lefty thing and all that with all the baggage from like decades ago. And now seeing like places like Texas, even in Canada, like Alberta, which is Canada's Texas, you could say, is the
Mhm.
leader in Canada too, right? So like it's actually seeing like, people like Rick Perry and like I'm hopeful that actually this coming from more conservative voices will sort of break through that barrier.
Yeah, I think that's what was needed. And, I'm a kid from New York. God bless Texas. They just have a very high veteran population there. And, that one chance meeting between Marcus and Governor Perry, I mean, that changed the entire game. So you're absolutely right. Whether you like their politics or not, guys like Dan Crenshaw or Morgan Luttrell, those guys are up there. They just lay it out. Um, we need that. Yeah, we really need that. This is not a political issue. The donkeys and elephants need to stay out of this. This is a human issue. And, if you're trying to play to your base by pushing away from this stuff, man, tell me so I can pray for you. I mean, it's wrong.
Yeah. Wow. And I know in the case of Ibogaine was actually the storytelling part at $50 million that came out of Texas, like had a lot to do with the stories of people who had gone there, sort of like had more power into it than the science, right? Which is I'm hopeful about the summit that I'm organizing right now and getting these stories out. And why do you think it's important to tell these stories, even though it's very courageous? And why should people pay attention to these stories today?
These are raw. I mean, I don't know if you watched the Kentucky opioid abatement commission hearings. The it was a tearjerker. I mean, the power in these stories is incredible, and particularly from combat veterans. When you have some of our most highly trained elite warriors telling you that they were reduced, to wanting to take their own lives. I mean, then it kind of locks in. You go, holy crap! You took a guy who was here, and my story's one. I was an elite warrior. I was a degenerate drug addict for a while and suicidal. So when you tell those stories in a personal way, there's a lot of impact. And I'll tell you something that's changed over the years. I've been involved with the Veterans Mental Health Leadership Coalition since the start. Adam Marr runs that. That's a very special human being right there. But through him, I've spent a lot of time talking to legislators, and I can tell you that 4 years ago, we would walk in. I'd tell a short version of my story, and mouths would be hanging open, maybe even a tear here and there. But then I would tell them about the psychedelics, and they were like, what? They hadn't heard of this. They looked at me like I had three heads. Now, when you walk into those offices, they're like, yep, 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 yep. And that's because of years of veteran advocates telling their stories. And, the number is growing. It's amazing. I have a friend, Trey Warren, a guy I flew with in Missouri. I led him through one of my groups just a few months ago down at Ambio, and he came back home and told his story like right away. He's become a little bit of a poster boy in Missouri for their efforts there, and and he's been very effective because he's got a great story and he's an articulate guy. And a lot of these guys coming through, these guys are they're team members. They just by habit put the mission ahead of themselves. So when these guys figure out how to heal and they have these great stories and they tell them openly, it gives people permission to raise their hand and say, I'm broken, I need help. It also gives them hope that they can get there. And so I see that a lot. These guys go through the treatment and everybody wants to shout it from the rooftops. um, there's some danger in that. Sometimes you gotta focus on your own work for a while. I think that you don't want to be distracted from your integration. But yeah, just there's so many voices now, and collectively we've had the desired effect.
Thank you. Thank you. That makes total sense. Yeah, thanks for mentioning about that part of not doing that storytelling too early in your process because like it's both first for your own integration process, but also like things will come up. Like, like you said, you gotta walk that hallway, right? So better to start maybe telling that story a little bit somewhere in the middle of that hallway rather than just in the beginning of it. But
For sure. And, like you alluded to before, you don't want to identify with that brokenness. Not everybody who goes through an Ibogaine treatment needs to be an Ibogaine provider or, be a do medicine work. Some folks need to go back to the family business and raise their kids and, but they're informed by that. So it takes a little bit of effort to lock that in and make it part of who you are. But yeah, the storytelling is powerful. I mean, it's key.
yeah, thank you. And I'm so grateful for you and your courage to be here sharing that story. I learned a lot and I can't wait to share this with the world. Thank you, Mark, for everything you've done to this point, the work that you've done yourself. And you talked about it's about children are going to come after you. I would argue that it's going to impact people who are not even related to you, right? Because that trickles down. Like I actually think that millions that you were talking about is much going to be a much bigger number because people will always be touched by your story and you will no longer be a stranger to them. So thank you.
Yeah, and if you're more tuned into humanity, to our interconnectedness, there may be a small kindness you do to someone who maybe you wouldn't have noticed before, and who knows how that impacts their life. I mean, that's just the smallest thing. Sometimes just being seen for people who are lost can change our lives. So yeah. I mean, you just got to walk around and shine your light on everybody.
Yes, here's to that. Thank you, Mark. This is fantastic. And I look forward to doing a part two, hopefully one day.
Yeah, my brother. Thanks for hearing me, and good luck on this project. Love to support it.
Thank you.